Hello and welcome to the inaugural podcast of the all-new Science of Rowing. I'm Will Ruth, joined by co-hosts and fellow rowing strength and conditioning coaches Blake Gourlay and Joe DeLeo. And whether you know us from the Strength Coach Roundtable on Rowing Chat, or if you followed our individual work in strength training for rowing, or if you've just found us for the first time, welcome and thanks for checking out Science of Rowing. Our whole goal with this new project is mobilizing the wealth of academic research and resources on rowing training into coach and athlete education and training practices. If you tuned out when I said academic research, think again and give us a chance, because we hope to show you in the sample edition and in this podcast that this is a valuable resource for rowers and coaches of all levels that offers some great practical, actionable takeaways to achieve better rowing performance, technique, and resilience to injury. So what we're going to do here is just start with a brief introduction for each of us and how we got here, outline what you can expect from podcast episodes of the Science of Rowing, and then move into our discussion of the 3 research articles in the sample edition. So my name is Will Ruth. I'm a former junior rower, coached for 6 years as a strength coach and assistant coach with a men's college team in Washington State, and then moved to Vermont in 2019. I'm the author of the rowingstronger.com website and book, and a guest coach at the Craftsbury Sculling Center here in Vermont, coaching sculling camps and instructing strength training workshops. I have a bachelor's degree in kinesiology, a master's degree in sport coaching, and am a National Strength and Conditioning Association certified strength and conditioning specialist, and a member of the Vermont State NSCA Board Advisory Board. I also have a U.S. Rowing Level 2 certification. Over to Mr. Blake Gourlay.
Hey guys, so I spent 4 years rowing in high school. I was lucky enough to be recruited to a Division I program at Cal. Unfortunately, the first semester I got injured, but that created this interest in movement and injury reduction in the sport of rowing. I ended up coaching junior rowers for 9 years. I spent 2 years as a Division I strength coach for rowers specifically. Then I had a few internships, master's degree in exercise science, nearly a dozen certifications, and I just started and came out with my first book in the series, The Movement of Rowing.
I am Joe DeLeo. So I began rowing in 6th grade and have been involved in the sport ever since. I rowed in high school and college, and transitioned into coaching as a graduate assistant at Syracuse University men's rowing program. So my formal education and background is in sport, event, and hospitality management, and I have a master's degree in new media management, which is just a fancy way of talking about business and marketing. In 2013, I earned my CSCS, and I launched my own coaching and consulting business, Leo Training, in 2014. In the spring of 2015, I launched my own podcast, which now has over 100 plus interviews with experts and athletes focusing on high performance, strength and conditioning, injury rehabilitation, coaching, technique, and biomechanics. Currently, I work for Lawrence Memorial Hospital in Lawrence, Kansas, running their sports performance center. This role has allowed me to work alongside physical therapists and coach anyone from as young as middle schoolers to retirees and in between, as well as individuals discharged directly from rehabilitation. In addition to my full-time role there, I am also the head strength and conditioning coach for the Portuguese Rowing Federation, and I am a Missouri State Advisory Board member for the NSCA. You can check out more content on my website, leotraining.io.
So what we're going to do in these podcast episodes is break down the studies that we review in each issue and go beyond those written reviews in practical applications and discussion. So Blake, Joe, and I review and edit each other's work through the writing process, and we jot down notes of areas where we disagree or want to discuss more, or just have more questions or more lines of inquiry that don't fit into the written research review. We hope that this is going to be an engaging and different way to access the material and get into some of the nuance of the takeaways and the recommendations, and not just be a straight rehashing of our written reviews. So I want to talk a little bit before we get going on the specific studies about how we use science in our coaching and our recommendations for how you could put this material to use in your own coaching or training. one of the non-negotiable things as we were developing our idea for Science of Rowing and our first product in the sample edition is not being dogmatic in our coaching or delivery of takeaways. So academic research is just one piece of the overall puzzle. It's important to keep in the context of our coaching and training experience and the knowledge of our own individual situation to give us the best chance possible at success. And this is the essence of evidence-based practice. It's the midpoint of the best available research, the coaching or training experience, and then the knowledge of the coach or athlete values in their specific environment. So you won't hear us say like, science says do X, or similar phrases that suggest that we're putting total trust in the research articles, that the results of the study are universally and unimpeachably true, and that any other ways of doing things is just flat out wrong, because that's not how research or the world works. So we're always looking to find that combination and the midpoint of best available research, our own experience, and then how we can either implement ourselves or help you consider implementation in your own individual coaching or rowing setting. So in our experience as coaches, and we've done the Strength Coach Roundtable and Rowing Chat for the last 4 years. We've had a lot of conversations ourselves as we've moved through our different roles from different coaching environments. And so in our experience as coaches, and a strong motivator for us in starting this project, was that many coaches and rowers really underutilized the best available research part of that equation. And that's not without reason. Staying on top of rowing research means not only having access to costly academic research journals, but also having the time, desire, and the ability to read through new information, compare it with old information, evaluate the information for scientific accuracy and relevancy, and then actually figure out how to apply it. So as a result, a lot of the information and training practices are very heavy on the individual experience of the coach or athlete. But for some demographics, there's not much available information, or they're left to extrapolate training methods from other sports or from other demographics. So our goal with the Science of Rowing is to streamline the research process and provide relevant, actionable academic resources to enhance that individual experience. So sometimes for us that means reinforcing or strengthening a perspective or a current practice, and then other times it means questioning or modifying a perspective or a current practice. Blake or Joe, anything you guys want to add to that?
I'm good, man. You said it beautifully.
Okay, then in that case, I think we can just get right into our studies. Mine is the first up on the sample edition, so I'll keep rolling here. I reviewed the electromyography and kinematics of the trunk during rowing in elite female rowers study. And this is a 2009 study of 9 female rowers from the Canadian rowing team seeking to learn the muscle activation patterns of the trunk and the pelvis during erging. So the researchers also wanted to know if the trunk flexor and extensor muscles co-activate to stabilize the spine. They did a 2K erg test with 3D video kinematics and several EMG markers on the major muscles of the trunk and pelvis, and then analyzed a 5-stroke average from just the first 250 to 500 meter mark to get rowers after the starting sequence, but before they were fatigued. And what they found can guide our strength training for the trunk muscles, how we think about the stroke from a muscular perspective. So what they found was that the early phase of the drive from catch to mid-drive was characterized by very high outputs from the extensor muscles, which is the glutes, the hamstrings, the spinal erectors, and the latissimus dorsi, or the lats. And the trunk flexor muscles of the abdominals were minimally active in the early drive phase, but were highly active in the late drive phase. So they found very little co-contraction of the extensor and the flexor muscles. And what this suggests is that the extensor muscles are the muscles primarily stabilizing the spine and producing movement during the early drive phase. And that creates what the researchers described as a rigid lever on which the legs can exert force. The primary role of the abdominal muscles then is to act as a braking mechanism for the torso swing and reversal around the back end of the stroke. So that gives us sort of a picture of muscularly what's going on in the rowing stroke. And the implications for core training are what we've been hearing for a few years now from researchers like Dr. Fiona Wilson in Ireland and Dr. Kelly Wilpy in Australia, that we ought to be doing more of our core training for rowers with exercises that involve hip movement. So if the researchers have found high co-contraction, if the trunk flexors, the abdominal muscles, and the trunk extensors of the posterior chain muscles were highly active together, then that might support a more isometric approach that trains the extensors and flexors simultaneously. So the ubiquitous planks would be a good example of such an exercise. But because the information from this study suggests a pulsing pattern to the rowing stroke of extensor muscle activity early in the drive and then flexor muscle activity later in the drive, we should consider simulating those demands in the gym with our core muscle training exercise selection. So you can check out the rest of my article for more of the study takeaways and bonus content video that we all contributed to of different core exercise demonstrations. What we presented was a progression of sorts from isometric exercises like planks to exercises involving movement at the hands or the feet, like the stir the pot exercise, and then movement at the hips that most closely simulates the demands of the rowing stroke. And this is all with the primary goal of spinal stability. So that's sort of the quick notes from my study. What we'll do from here is just roll through some of those questions that we came up with as we went, and get into that.
Cool. Yeah. So I think one of the important points with your study is that like we understand more of the rowing dynamics, but we also can't just take the study for what it is and say that, planks are bad now, right? So I think we need to be clear when we say that, and we definitely say that in the article. One of the things that stood out about your article is that they categorize the transverse abdominis and the internal oblique as the same muscle. And I wonder, from my perspective, if that had an impact on the results, because my understanding of the core is that it braces, it supports the spine during the duration of the stroke, which obviously is an isometric contraction, which we train in the plank. And the transverse abdominis is deep to the internal oblique. But if we look at the angles of the fibers, it changes what the actions of the muscles are, even though they basically both wrap and support the spine, right?
Yeah. So the reason the researchers did it that way is because it's a surface EMG reading. So it's a one electro thing that goes on that can only, it can't give you two signals from the same muscle when they're sort of right on top of each other. They can't give you two different signals for two different muscles that are right on top of each other. So they had to lump them together for the purposes of that. But like you're exactly right that if those two muscles are doing two different functions and yet we're lumping them in under the same one, then that is a limitation of the study.
Yeah, and the coactivation of the flexors and the extensors. So basically, the front side of my core contracting at the same intensity as the back side of my core. We have to realize that there's a thin balance, and Joe, I know you have input on this as well. And there's a thin balance because obviously the extensors are supporting the spine and helping us swing open, but we also have the flexors, even though they're not activated to the same degree, resisting excess extension, right? So when you hear about injuries like I had with my spondy, I'm just going to say spondy because I can't pronounce the whole thing correctly. Basically, it's fracturing of the spine. And what researchers have found is sometimes it doesn't happen from some sort of traumatic incident. Sometimes it happens because your extensors are so strong that they can actually snap and break our own spines. So not having the flexors working, even though it's not to the same degree as the extensors, might be a reason that we're remaining safe. So I think that's something that stood out to me in terms of like, we have to be aware that like, just because it's saying this, like the flexors are still activating to the right degree to keep the right amount of pressure off our back.
Yeah. And I wonder too if a factor in rowing is not that like the resistance of the blade against the water is part, or the fan on the erg in this case, is part of what keeps the athlete from going into excessive extension. Because if they're resisting against that force, then they couldn't pull themselves forward on that force, right? So I think that was what I took away from this, was that the extensors can do most of the movement because they're working against the resistance of the erg or of the water. But to your point, minimally active or not significantly active in this doesn't mean like no activity at all. So if you didn't have, and there's some of those cool diagrams, the one of the skeleton doing the squat and they tack the different muscles on at the different points. If if we could do one of those for rowing, like if you didn't have abdominal muscles, you would still be in trouble because you still need to be able to maintain overall torso tightness. But I think that the main takeaway from this study for me is that if we're focusing all of our training on the abdominal muscles and on the trunk flexors, then we're missing sort of most of the power picture and the stability picture until we get to the back end of the stroke. And I think that a lot of people think about it as more like, oh no, like really high activity at the front end of the stroke when you're delivering a lot of the force in the early drive.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. One of the things that I took away, especially from your summary as we were opening up here, is talking about, you know, the role of the extensor muscles early on in the early part of the drive phase, and then the abdominals coming on at the later part of the drive phase, like sort of around that release or the finish of the stroke, if you will. So
yeah, because it's the braking mechanism and then the reversal from layback back to the recovery.
Right. And so to me, like what I think it kind of highlighted or painted a better picture of is that we sort of can't say one is more important than the other. They're both important, and they come on or have greater priority at different points within the rowing stroke, right? So from a training perspective, you know, how can we help, you know, coaches and athletes in terms of application? I think one, it's making sure that they understand that there's emphasis on both of those, right? The extensors and the flexors, and thinking about it from a racing standpoint, right? And while the study was done on the erg, you know, we also know that an endurance component is really important for not only for the sport for performance, but that's a huge functionality part of the core musculature, right? So when we look at our training, building up so that musculature in and around the spine has a higher endurance component to it, so that we're maintaining good position later in the race, maintaining better posture, we're not breaking down, and allowing us to continue to perform at a high level.
Yeah, I would have been really interested to see. I mean, I understand why they took the 5-stroke average from the 250 to the 500-meter chunk, because you get them when they're not fatigued, but it's after the start, so you've got sort of those mechanics out of the way. But I would have been really interested to see this compared to like something from the last, you know, the 1750 mark. And
100%.
Does the muscular activity change at that point?
Yeah, does muscle activity change? Yeah. And also, you know, on top of that, are they starting to notice changes in like the spinal kinematics or posture, right? So then it kind of paints a little bit of a different picture. My guess is that not only do they just use those 5 strokes as a snapshot, because I'm sure analyzing those 5 strokes was probably very intensive, is my guess too.
Yeah, it's also part of how EMG works best. EMG is most helpful for comparing basically 2 similar positions with 1 difference, but in a low fatigue environment. Because I think that if they did take it from the last, like the 1750 point, there might be just sort of so much noise in that signal that they wouldn't actually be able to get a really clear answer out. Because when the fatigue's really high or when the effort's really maximal, the muscle activity is just harder to interpret. So I think it's both like, yeah, the simplicity of being able to analyze it and the data that they were trying to get, but also the limitations of the technology that we have to measure the tools. That's again why, like to Blake's point, we would never say that like something is bad based on one study, or that comes back to what I said in the intro of like, we're not going to say science says do X, but it's just, this is a study that points us in this direction, and here's the takeaways that we can draw for our coaching and training purposes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the other thing I wanted to touch upon too was, you know, we talked a lot about the EMG muscle activity kind of so far, but let's talk about how this can relate to the athlete's lumbopelvic positioning in the stroke. So in the first 10% of the stroke, you know, at beginning of the drive phase rather, the subjects demonstrated pelvic and lumbar segments moving from positions of flexion into extension. So, you know, thinking about this, how would that potentially change as they're entering higher degrees of fatigue, right? And then how does that influence how we need to train to make sure they're able to maintain those positions, or stronger positions rather?
Yeah, and so what that's basically saying is that they were somewhat flexed at the catch, and then right when they started the stroke, there was some movement from being somewhat flexed into somewhat extended, right?
Right.
And so the researchers still found that they were creating that rigid lever of the spine, and what that basically means is that the legs can do a lot of the force, the spine just transmit force to the handle of the erg in this case, or to the handle of the oar as they're rowing on water. But if there's movement at the lumbar spine and at that lumbopelvic juncture between the lumbar spine and the pelvis, then that's potentially wasted force, right? Because it's just moving spinal segments. It's not actually getting to the handle.
Right. So that probably just reinforces the idea that we need that part of the body to be stable to transmit force up the kinetic chain to the handle, as you just said. Yeah.
Yeah, because if there's a lot of movement there, it's just moving that back and forth, but it's not actually generating force or propulsive force.
So it's a dual effect of loss of performance, and your potential injury risk is going up.
Wear and tear on the spine,
right,
on the disc and stuff. Yeah.
Right. So the other thing I wanted to make sure, we didn't have it marked down in our prep notes here, but it was something you and I had talked about before. So in talking about core training for rowers, I think one of the things that'd be fun for you and I to discuss on air is talking about like that progression of teaching, right? So we talked a little bit about the where's a good place to start, for somebody in terms of like using something, for example, like say like the dead bug, the McGill Big Three, which is a curl up, side plank or side bridge, and the bird dog, right? And I had said, I think we should start in a supine position, starting with a dead bug. It's probably one of the easiest, regressions or starting points for an individual. But you came at it from a different standpoint, which kind of got me thinking. So why did you say to move it later, and what's your rationale behind that?
I think it's not so much about moving things later as much as it is about regressing some of the more challenging exercises. So sort of approaching it from even a different perspective. I know like Dr. Kelly Wilkie, who we gave the credit to on at least introducing us to one of those exercises, and has put out some great research on rowing and athlete health in general. I know that like she starts to use the rock back exercise from the video with fairly beginner athletes, because my rationale is that if they're going to be rowing anyway, then they're already doing that motion, because they've already got their hips in movement while their spine has to be stable. So if we're training somebody like in a lab, before they ever touch an oar sort of thing, then I think we can institute like this really strict progression of prerequisites and checkpoints and moving through exercises. But if we assume that like they're already doing these motions on the water, then I think it makes more sense to put them in that challenging environment so that they can start to learn the motor learning side of it as well as the muscular development side of it. So with that rock back, they're learning how to keep contact with heels into the ground, the spine stable as they lay back. Maybe they won't lay back as far as when they're stronger, and I think they should still be doing other exercises too to develop other proficiencies. But so for me, it's more of a blended model, less of like a strict stage-based progression.
No, that all makes sense. I'm not quite sure you you addressed my point that I was thinking of there in regards to specifically the dead bug and stuff. So
okay.
Because I was kind of coming at it more from like, I think when you originally, and this is probably pointing more to the video included for our bonus content on our YouTube channel. So when I think of that, part of it is because I'm working in a rehab environment and I'm around physical therapy every day, right? So I see a lot of people that are in a state of pain and working in a state of pain. So what's the safest, lowest threshold exercise we can prevent an individual with and start from there? We can always build to some of those things. Is a healthy rower, should they be able to do what you just described? I would absolutely agree with you. However, what I would say is if they're coming from the injury standpoint and we're trying to get them to return to sport, we might have to go back to the beginning and be using something like the dead bug.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think like in general, most of our stuff is going to be targeted to like the asymptomatic rower, right? Because we're strength coaches. You've got this great experience coming from the hospital and the rehab background and working in that return to sport dynamic. But for the rest of us, like if an athlete presents with an injury or with a pain, if we can't sort of figure it out immediately, I just refer to a physical therapist because they've got a lot more education and a lot more experience working with athletes and the liability coverage to be able to work with them. So
100%.
That's a good clarification for our audience that, yeah, obviously if this stuff causes pain or if you are rehabbing from an injury, then yes, let's not jump into the deep end right away.
Yeah. Do you ever factor in like thinking about the neurodevelopmental sequence in terms of regressing or progressing with core training? Like, so moving from that, supine to quadruped, you have rocking or rolling or crawling in there, and then progressing into, a half kneeling and then a standing posture.
I tend to use the exercises more simultaneously, but using each of them. So, on one day we might use a dead bug, and on the next day we might use like the seated rock back, or on another day I have the full tension plank in my warm up because I think it's useful to activate all of the musculature that we're going to go use, whether we're lifting or whether we're rowing. So I still think that there's utility in all of those things. I'm just not sure that there's a strict prerequisite and stage-based approach to it. And I think we sort of struck a compromise in the bonus content video of having it laid out by biomechanical rationale. And I think that's a sensible, that's how I think about it is, okay, we're going to use like a high stability exercise here. And we're going to do, with a beginner training, we're going to do more stability work early on because they need to develop that musculature. But we're also going to include a little bit of the motor learning work of like, let's actually use the muscles the way that we're doing it in the stroke so that they can start to develop those skills. And then as the athlete develops, what I do is sort of shift the emphasis over time. So with more advanced athletes doing fewer planks and increasing the challenge of the exercise more, mostly too because planks become not challenging.
Yeah.
And then what do? You start piling 45-pound plates or toddlers on their back, or you start holding it for 2 or 3 minutes or more. And I think then you're getting into a different exercise and more injury risk. So,
great points.
I think from a coach's perspective that was really focused on movement, a lot of the testing I did, one of the tests was the push-up screen from the FMS, and what that shows us is reflexive core, right? So we have like reactive core, which is basically like full tension plank or just getting ready for a punch, and then we have reflexive core, which is more natural, right?
Like
it's just supposed to happen.
Dynamic movement, right?
Yeah, it's just supposed to happen when it happens.
Yeah.
At the right time, right? And if we don't have the right timing and the right tension of all the muscles involved of supporting the spine and et cetera, we're going to have errors in movement, right? So like from my perspective, when I saw someone had a 1, which is a poor score on the push-up, they almost always had excess motion in their lumbar spine when they're rowing. So from that perspective is like, if they can't be in a dynamic fashion, like on the rowing machine or on the water without having excess motion at the spinal segments, then it would be a good idea to start them in an isometric position, whether or not that involves movement of the hips or not, right?
Yeah.
And this is a healthy individual. It's just an individual that's not prepared yet.
Healthy, though dysfunctional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think, like you guys have said already, like the answer's in the middle. And it's not necessarily taking like one thing or the other. It's understanding the individual and tailoring it to them, making sure we're not doing too much too soon or too little for too long, right?
And if I had one sort of like sum up elevator pitch for this article and for our discussion, it would be that if you're a rower and the great majority of your core training right now is planks and isometrics, start including some other things, because isometric core is not actually how, according to this study, the trunk and pelvic muscles work or function in the rowing stroke. So we've got to start including some of those other exercises. They're not particularly equipment heavy. So let's start to branch out from basically just planks. And I think that's a good breaking point for core. So Blake, why don't you bring us up to date on your study?
Yeah, so I looked at this study that looked at textured insoles and the impact it had on rowers. A little background real quick. So there's a bunch of mechanoreceptors in our feet, and they respond to touch and vibration primarily. And when we're wearing shoes all the time with extra cushion, we don't get the same stimulus. We don't get the same feedback that we normally would. And when we don't get the same feedback, it might change something about our movement, or like we were just talking with Core, when things fire at what time and what intensity, right? So what this study did was they took 11 elite rowers, and they looked at 3 insole types. So they had one that was just to control what we're used to wearing. 2 was low density, which had like sprinkles of bumps, and then 3 had high density, which was more bigger bumps. And they had them all perform 30 max pressure strokes at rates 18, 24, and 32. And then what they did was they looked at how that impacted their stroke, specifically mechanics at the foot plate. And the 2 major findings were that they found that there was greater force against the foot plate. So they were able to apply greater force with their foot, against the foot plate. And they also found that there was greater contact area between the foot and the foot plate, which is really interesting. And I connect those two to being able to transfer more force and also being able to use bigger, stronger muscles that have better leverage sooner and more effectively. And then 2 other things I wanted to highlight real quick was, although it was statistically insignificant, they found that there was a power difference of 11 watts between the control insole and the high density insole. And if 11 watts doesn't sound like that much, but if you translate it to splits, it ends up being 1.1 splits, which okay, now everyone realizes that could be significant, right?
That's 4 seconds over a 2K, right?
Yeah. So that could be huge. Just putting something that stimulates your foot, which doesn't even get in the way of your stroke, might actually make you faster. And then we know that no matter what side we row, or if we're a sculling athlete, we realize that there's always an asymmetry in foot force kinematics, and that foot force asymmetry creates torque at our hips, and it can work our way up our body and cause all sorts of issues. And then that's also going to add extra drag on the boat, and it's also going to decrease our performance. So again, this finding was statistically insignificant, but they found that there was a 4% decrease in the asymmetry and foot force. So I wanted to highlight those 2 because I thought they're important, and there's obviously things the study has to work on, but pretty interesting to think that doing something as simple as standing on something with bumps might actually change your technique.
Something as simple and not as elaborate as those the swimsuits that are super sculpted to have water flow off and stuff. It's not FISA banned, right? Are there any rules against using textured insoles in any of the federations right now?
Not that I know of. I don't even know if anyone knows about them yet.
Yeah.
But
interesting.
Yeah.
So Blake, I think a good kind of question to ask, right, in regards to the textured insoles is, how do the textured insoles compare to, say, a Shimano shoe or the BatLogic shoes? Because that might be a question that a lot of coaches or rowers have. Well, isn't that the same thing? Yeah.
So we're talking the insole. So the insole in your shoe is just flat and smooth, right? And as far as I know, in both those shoes, BatLogic and Shimano, sorry, they're both also smooth. So unless I'm wrong there, that's not changing the texture at all. But those shoes themselves there's definitely benefits to them because of the flexibility and how it allows you to adjust to the individual athlete, and you have toe spread, etc. But it's missing the fact that just somehow adding extra stimulus to the bottom of my foot might have a positive impact.
Right.
And there's they've found less fall risk and better balance and stuff with people obviously outside of rowing, of just walking around, right? So that again is speaking to the role of the mechanoreceptors of just having more stimulation there does something to the way that we interact with our environment.
Yeah, and it's not like this study just came out of the middle of nowhere. Like they've been trying this on people that have different health issues. They've been trying it on healthy athletes, and they've been finding different benefits with each population. So I've heard of like the people who have tremors. Like I've heard that if they put those on, that they either decrease or they're less often, or they disappear completely. So there's something to it, and it's worth looking into.
Yeah, I think part of the appealing thing is that it's not a particularly high tech thing. It's an insole. The athlete could take it with them, put it in the boat. Could you leave it in there and have multiple athletes use the same one, and as long as it fits the shoes, it's okay, or does it need to be customized?
I mean, what I would do is I would probably take the insole out and just put yours in, but I'm sure you could also put it on top. And you just cut it to fit your shoe, so you can just take it with you every time, or you could leave it if you have your own shoes.
Yeah, yeah. The statistically significant, but athletically significant is an interesting thing. That like obviously we want to be careful when we're using results that don't rise to statistical significance, because what that suggests is that there could be interference in the data that's causing that. But also, like, athletic performance is not governed by statistical significance. So if we're talking about 4 seconds over a 2K, like that's a potentially huge difference, even if it doesn't reach the academic definition of statistical significance. So you want to be careful with it, but we can certainly say that like the results trend in this direction, and therefore it's worth more research and personal experimentation.
I think the other thing to point out too with the textured insoles here is that, we're highlighting, the statistical insignificant, but as Will said, athletic, difference. That could be a massive change in a 2K. But also just think about if you were to train on a daily basis with that type of stimulation on the bottom of your foot day after day, like how much better boat feel you would develop, right? Like how much that would impact your rowing stroke because you're getting so much more sensory input, right? So I think there's the other element of that, like it's the athleticism element, right? You're allowing that athlete to really tune in and become aware of their environment a lot more, and then you just stack up all of those strokes over time.
Rowers are very used to marginal gains anyway, right?
Yeah, at a certain point we are. I mean, it's true.
I think the interesting thing here is that like it's not, and Blake, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you've studied more on this, but it's not a conscious mechanism, right? It's not like the athlete's thinking, oh, I can feel this now, so I can push harder, right? It's just subconsciously something's happening that allows the athlete to express more force.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just sending us like extra signals basically, and it just fires the right things at the right time with the right intensity. Right. That's the simplest way I could say it. And the interesting part about the statistically insignificant power increase, what was statistically significant was they found greater force against the foot plate. Mm-hmm. So if I'm applying greater force against the foot plate, there's other studies that show that significantly impacts rowing performance. Mm-hmm. So like, where's the force going, right? It's going to translate into the oar handle. It's going to increase boat speed as far as I would assume. So I do think there's something with the power there as well.
Yeah.
Cool.
Do you think that we'll see like textured seat pads? I mean, like how far do we go with the mechanoreceptors? The idea that just increasing stimulation is beneficial. I don't know if anybody wants to really go down that rabbit hole, but I mean, is this something special about the foot, or is it just the articulation of the rower to the equipment?
Yeah, it's definitely the foot. I don't know anything about stimulating the the butt, but
you got to say it.
But yeah, it's the foot, because I mean, naturally, it's the first thing that we put in contact with the floor, besides when we're babies and crawling, and our hands also have a lot of the similar receptors, right? So they're extra sensitive to the stimulation. So yeah, it's specifically the foot, and that sends signals up the rest of our body.
Yep.
And I know you mentioned in the article that like it's they tend to run about $50 to try. If I find some for $5 on a website, are those just as good, or are there red flags that people should look out for scams or particularly reliable brands that you found?
Yeah, so I've honestly only found one that I trust, which is Naboso, um, and it's the 1.5 insole. And I talked to the creator of the insole, and they have like a 1.0 and a 1.5, and she recommended the 1.5 because she's like, well, most rowers wear socks, right, in the boat. And I was like, yeah,
Yeah,
most
we
rowers
hope.
do.
Yeah.
So the 1.5 is like a little extra stimulus to work through the sock. But if you row without socks, the 1.0 would probably be just fine. But what I like about those is like she's a successful podiatrist who has experience in the sports performance field, and there's just like hundreds of little bumps on hers to stimulate all these different nerve endings. So it's not just like, oh, you got a bump in the middle of your insole, right? Which is what you see with some of them. And then some of the insoles you see don't have anything. And they're like, oh, yeah, it's stimulating your foot. I was like, I see nothing. It's literally flat. So that's what I would watch for. But yeah, I haven't been able to find any that are more affordable that seem like they would be worthwhile.
Because that's $50 for one rower, who has their own single or their own erg or something like that. That doesn't seem like a very significant cost. But if you're a coach listening to it and you want to buy a set of 8 for your athletes, then that adds up a little bit quicker. So I think there might be some people tempted to sort of, yeah, Joe.
But I would say that $50, I bet, is actually much more inexpensive than compared to the Shimano or BatLogic shoes if you were stacking those prices up.
But different things, right? Because what those shoes allow you to do is tilt the foot plate or broaden them out or change the angle.
Yeah, definitely different things. But I think, at the end of the day, you're still making some adjustments to rigging with those two shoes that we just mentioned, but 2, like trying to get more, stimulation out of the foot and ankle complex, right? So this might be a more cost-effective introductory option to try out if you can't afford, an 8's worth of, BatLogic or Shimano shoes, insoles. Plus, to Blake's point, if it's something that you can cut out and get to the contour of the athlete's foot, they can actually swap that out and use that, in a different boat and take it with them, which is probably a lot quicker than swapping out shoes and stuff all the time too.
Yeah. All right. Well, Blake, anything else you want to say on that one before we move on to Joe's?
No, let's move on.
Yeah.
All right, man. Bringing up the grand finale here. So my study was on injuries in Masters rowers. So a couple noteworthy highlights. This was actually the first study done on Masters rowers, and it was a retrospective study. So this was going back in time, contacting the participants after the event had occurred. So there were 743 participants out of 1,000 that were invited to participate in the study. All of the 743 competed at the 2007 FISA World Masters Regatta, and it was split 475 men, 268 women, aging from as young as 27 years of age to 60 plus, which comprises all the different age groups for a Masters rower. So few noted takeaways before we get into some discussion. Similar to other rowing demographics, the lumbar spine continues to be the number one injury site for the Masters rower as well. A significant number of injuries for the Masters rower actually occurred during cross training, so 43.7%. So that's something to note. And then finally, the oldest age group, the F plus age group, saw a shift in the injury site to the upper body, so shifting away from the low back. They still had that injury, but more predominantly you started to see it occur in the upper body. And that's something we'll get more into in the discussion, but it's something to definitely keep on the top of your mind.
Yeah, I thought the cross training was a significant takeaway from that one, and I thought that was something that just came up in Kelly Wilkie's latest study from Team Australia, was that a significant amount of their injuries occurred from road biking accidents.
And that's happening more and more. That's happening more and more. And again, trying to not to get too far off of topic from the Masters rower study, but to the point you're making, I think it was in the lead up to London, the 2012 games, but in 2008, Drew Ginn and Duncan Free won the men's pair at the Beijing Olympics. And I'd have to go back and double check and confirm, but I'm pretty sure Duncan was making a comeback along with Drew for the 2012 London Olympic Games and actually got into a pretty bad cycling accident and had to stop training. So to the point of the study you're mentioning, outside of it, cycling is becoming a cross-training activity that rowers are utilizing more and more. But it also comes with the caveat of having to worry about pretty significant injuries that are going to wipe you out for a long time.
Yeah, because it was in this study, 43% of acute injuries that occurred during cross-training.
Yep.
So that's only looking at like sudden, semi-traumatic, not chronic or overuse injuries, which is what we're more used to seeing from rowing and rowing training.
Yes, and that's a really good point to make, is that those cross-training injuries were acute, right? So you're talking about like essentially an event that something's happening.
Like a tear or a break or a really significant bruise if you fall off your bike or something, right?
100%. Yep.
Yeah.
You guys have no idea how many athletes I've had get injured just doing something stupid.
Okay.
And it's not that like biking's bad, right?
No.
Like we should be able to do all these things and be safe, but we have to realize that like if it's not our sport, and maybe we're getting close to an important competition, like you have to really be careful that you are putting yourself at risk. And also, like, Joe, do they include weight training or strength training as cross training as well?
Yes, it did. It fell under that category as well. Yep.
Yeah. So I've seen that kind of thing in studies before where they're like, well, 14% of injuries are caused by weightlifting or whatnot. And then people get scared of weightlifting. I think it's more of like, make sure you realize what you're doing, make sure you're starting at the right point, and maybe you have supervision if you need it.
I think it's also the risk of acute injury is different because that's like a misloaded bar could cause an acute injury, right? Or I've seen it where an athlete was deadlifting and somebody cut through the platform behind them and hit the bar as they had it like at their shins, and it tweaked the back because there's the dog. It tweaked their back because it caused this like sudden windmilling of the bar. And so there's an injury that was caused by weightlifting, but it was really caused by somebody being stupid and trying to take a shortcut through a weight room.
Yeah.
But this made me think about something that I've possibly been guilty of, which is that we know that long training on the ergs and really high meters on the ergs can be an injury risk. And so it's easy to say, well, let's do cross-training instead. Well, but we should realize that our cross-training modality might also have an injury risk. So is our injury risk greater from switching to a cross-training modality, or is it greater from continuing to use the erg for long and slow pieces, going over the 30-minute continuous barrier, all that kind of stuff? So just like the nuance of the recommendation is making sure that we're saying that when we just recommend cross-training, that we're maybe a little bit more specific with that recommendation of what exactly that entails.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Absolutely. Other thing to touch on before I forget. So coming back to that F+ age group, all right. So I noted at the beginning that we saw a shift in the injury site to the upper body. So that would include cervical, so your neck, elbow, forearm, and wrist. So any of that would fall into that category. So why this could potentially be something to pay attention to as a Masters rower is the following. So the research and the researchers suggested that there may potentially be a shift in rowing technique as we get to that age. So one of the things you're dealing with as you age is sarcopenia, loss of lean muscle mass, as well as strength, right? So if you're losing strength and not able to maintain that, it may be understood or it could not you could see it potentially changing the rowing technique to use the upper body more, right? So that now they're starting to break earlier with the arms, grab with the hands, the elbows are breaking, they're using more of the shoulders. And that might potentially be a reason why we are seeing that injury migrate to that part of the body.
Yeah, the biomechanical term for that is summing forces, S-U-M, as in to add. And it basically says that if the athlete's not strong enough to do it in a segmented fashion, they will do it by getting a bunch of force altogether. So think about like how you throw a dart versus how you throw a bowling ball. When you throw a bowling ball, you're going to get a lot more behind it and sort of open everything up all at once. Versus with a dart, you're just going to stand there and you can segment it out really quick because it's super light. And I've definitely seen what you're describing with athletes on the other end of the spectrum, with younger, weaker athletes who are overgeared or just aren't strong enough to deal with the forces on the boat or on the erg, and they start bending the elbows early, swinging the body early because their legs aren't strong enough to deliver that early catch force. So I can totally see what you're saying on the other side of the spectrum. If we're not training to maintain lower body strength through the aging process, that as people age, that they'll get to more of that open it all up at once stroke and end up using a lot more lower body or a lot more upper body.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I didn't even think of that, to just think about the junior rower where maybe they haven't developed the foundational level of strength yet, and it's the rigging and the gearing of the boat is way too heavy, and they can't even begin to sequence. So they're just gonna grab with the upper body because that's what they know they can do.
And you see that, I mean, just go look at, the video of Brian Shaw, the strongman, setting the record on the 100 meters on the earth. It's 100 meters. He's just open everything all at once. And so, right. I mean, you see that on the erg or with people who use like too much bungee or too much can weight if they're doing added load training. Yeah.
I think it's worth considering the experience level too. Like obviously these were all experienced masters rowers because they were at this competition.
Yep.
But just because you're a masters rower doesn't mean you're a master at rowing, right? So it could also be a technical breakdown and just not a ton of experience or not as much coaching. Like the masters coaches get as much coaching as juniors or collegiate rowers? No. Right? So it could be something as simple as that too.
Yes. To that point, one thing that I do remember off the top of my head after that response, Blake, is they did note that masters rowers who had a elite level of experience earlier in their rowing career actually also did not get injured as frequently. So that's something to note as well. So does that point to potentially those athletes have been training at a high level for a long time, and so they maybe understand their bodies better, or they know how to adjust a training program better on their own? Don't know. Those questions aren't answered. However, there is some evidence to suggest they're getting injured at a lower frequency.
Yeah, it's good to think about. I mean, there's plenty of those sort of the chicken or the egg sort of things, but if we're thinking about those as other contributors to injuries, then I think we're going deeper in our understanding of training practices. One of the notes that I wrote down was masters rowers from the F+ group who cannot perform longer training sessions on the erg due to functional decrease in strength and balance are more prone to acute injuries in the low back, even when performing shorter rowing distances. And that seemed like one of those lines that they put in there that has like a bunch of implications into it, but that it's just one sentence in the research. So I mean, I think that would be an interesting one to discuss, because it's basically saying that they've lost strength and balance, so they can't do longer training sessions. Therefore, they do shorter training sessions, but they still experience more acute low back injuries. Right.
So that's definitely one. It would be helpful if we had a little bit more to go off of, as you just said. But so a couple of things that jump to my mind is this is the same age group that we saw a higher migration to upper body injuries. So are they becoming, and these are questions, are they becoming more injured because during that 30 minutes they are now trying to increase the intensity? So they're moving back and forth, and they're placing more stress on their low back. Is question number one. Two, is it also a change in like technique? So again, we don't know. Those are two things that pop to my mind when we're talking about that specific sentence.
Yeah, because it didn't quantify what they were doing with the short sessions.
Right.
So the research overall is that once you go over 30 minutes continuous, there starts to be more movement at the lower spine and at the pelvis, and that may contribute to injury. So research suggests that we keep those below 30 minutes if we're going to do continuous pieces, break it up with a small amount. But that doesn't say just go do all the work as intensity work.
Right.
Especially not if there's a technical thing or something else going on, or just the higher load of the erg. So I mean, it's an interesting statement, but I think maybe without further data and further elaboration that we don't have a ton to go on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Blake, anything to chime in there?
Yeah, I just think reading that statement could make you think that means you should be doing like 60-minute pieces straight.
Right. Yeah.
And that would have like a protective mechanism. So we do have to be careful that that's not our conclusion.
Yeah.
Although it could be, I guess, but that's not our takeaway.
Well, so what that makes me think is like, if you're a master's rower in the F+ group and you can't perform longer sessions on the erg due to functional decrease in strength and balance, then we know that we're more prone to more acute injuries in the low back. So let's do the same intensity, but just shorter times and split up. So instead of going 30 minutes all at once, do 3x10 with a 60-second break at the exact same training parameters that you would have done your 30 minutes with.
And that's a great training suggestion, because that actually, we know that they're not going to get any difference in cardiovascular benefit. You're still going to get the same training effect.
Back to the same heart rate. Yeah.
However, the benefits you are going to get are by standing up, you're going to take some stress off of your, lumbopelvic complex. You're going to stretch your hips out. So you're going to give your body a break and walk around and get out of that seated posture. So that's as Dr. McGill would say, that's a good spine hygiene practice to do.
Yeah, you're getting a little bit of spinal benefit for essentially no loss in heart rate training effectiveness.
Right.
Yeah. We hope you enjoyed this discussion and the sample edition of Science of Rowing. You can find more from us and subscribe at scienceofrowing.com, with new editions published each month. We are also on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Science of Rowing. Make sure to check out the bonus content for this edition too, for additional materials to help move knowledge into coaching and training practice. Until next time, happy training.